Thank you, thank you. I decided today that I wanted to do something that I hoped would excite a student. The worst thing in the world, I've always thought as a student, and I still think so as a professor, is to go to a lecture and to be bored stiff. Y'all been there? And you're like, it's torture. You're like, oh God. And then you think, is the teacher gonna ask me some questions about this madness? Because I didn't even feel like taking notes. They bored me stiff. So my aim here is not to bore you at all, but to in fact propose some possibilities that might make for a really, really interesting discussion. And I decided that I'm going to both talk and kind of perform for you a bit. This Underground Railroad lecture is centered around the life of Frederick Douglass. And I wanted to talk just a few minutes about Frederick Douglass as a potential womanist, a man who in the 19th century supported in some ways women's suffrage and women's rights when other men, black or white, were not supporting it. And I want to talk specifically about Frederick Douglass's 1888 speech at the International Women's Council in DC. And to kind of walk you through this speech and to show you some places where I think Frederick Douglass does a great job, and then other places where he contradicts himself and where he, in fact, not only does he not support women, but I think I'm going to make a couple of bold assertions that I think he's even insulting to women. And in some ways, he's almost hopelessly patriarchal in his inability to see the relevance for and the need for his support of women's issues if they don't in some kind of way benefit him as a man. So anyway, here we go. Frederick Douglass opens this speech with, he says, "Mrs. President," and he's talking to Elizabeth Cady Stanton particularly, "I come to this platform with unusual diffidence. Although I have been identified with the woman suffrage movement and have often spoken in its favor, I am somewhat at a loss to know what to say on this really great and uncommon occasion where so much has already been said. When I look around on this assembly and see the many able and eloquent women full of the subject, ready to speak, and who only need the opportunity to impress the audience with their views and thrill them with their thoughts that breathe and words that burn, I do not feel like taking up more than a very little amount of space of your time and attention, and that is what I shall do. I would not even now presume to speak, for the circumstance of my early connection with the cause and of having been called upon to do so by one whose voice in the council we already gladly obey." He says, "I want to say men have very little business here. Very little business here. And even smaller business as speakers. And if they come here at all, they should take back benches and wrap themselves in silence. For this is an international council, not of men, but of women. And women should have all the say. This is her day in court. I do not mean to exalt the intellect of woman above man, but I have heard many men speak on the subject, some of them the most eloquent to be found anywhere in the country. And I believe no man, however gifted with thought and speech, can voice the wrongs and present the demands of women with the skill and effect, with the power and the authority of woman herself. Woman knows and feels her wrongs as man cannot know and feel them. And she also knows as well as she can know what measures are needed to redress them. She is her own best representative. We can neither speak for her, nor vote for her, nor act for her, nor be responsible for her. And the thing for men to do in the premises is just to get out of the way and give the woman the fullest opportunity to exercise all the powers inherent in her individual personality and allow her to do it as she herself shall elect to exercise it. Her right to be and to do is as full, complete, and perfect as the right of any man on earth. I say of her as I say of the colored people, give her fair play and take your hands off. There was a time when, perhaps, we men could help a little. It was when this woman's suffrage cause was in its cradle, when it was not big enough to go alone, when it had to be taken in the arms of its mother from Seneca Falls, New York to Rochester, New York for baptism. I then went along with it and offered my services to help it, for then it needed help. but now it can afford to dispense with me and all of my sex. Then its friends were few, now its friends are many. Then it was wrapped in obscurity, now it is lifted in the sight of the whole civilized world, and people of all lands and languages give it their hearty support. Truly, the change is vast and wonderful. This is how Douglas opens. And Douglas seems to be saying a very great thing, right? You know, women, wow, y'all have worked it out. Sisters, I applaud you. Yes. Brothers, men, get out of the way. But I want to suggest something here that I've thought for some time, and that is, I think Douglas is wrong. I think the first reason Douglas is wrong is because I do not think that you support women as a man by being silent and getting out of the way. I think the way you support women is by being in the way, by being committed to it, without having to be central to it just because you're a male. I do not think that because Douglas could not understand himself as the center of the council, he could not understand why a man would in fact even be on the program, he later says in the speech, that he's right when he says, then men should just take our hands off of it. I think the problem is that we as men in this country, and brothers, y'all might have to help me, or I'm just maybe in trouble here. I don't think that we have ever I don't think our humility has been called upon to understand what it means to honor a woman unless we can see how it will benefit maleness and masculinity. Right? And I think that because of that, we have fallen far short of what we've understood ourselves to be as supporters of righteousness and justice. What we really mean is supporters of male righteousness and male justice. Right? When there are rape seminars, for example, why don't men go? Anytime you have rape seminars, it's just full of women. But the irony is, usually in this country, when there's an act of rape, half of that act is male. But somehow we surrender that issue unto women. When there are issues dealing with birth and conception, it's women who show up. Some kind of way, just like Douglas here in 1888, Douglas cannot seem to figure out what he's supposed to be doing. And I find that really strange of a man of Douglas's erudition, a man of Douglas's brilliance. I'm sure Elizabeth Cady Stanton wouldn't say, look here, let me tell you exactly what to do, man. Go over here and talk to these white men in this legislation, since they won't even hear from a woman, right? And see if you can help convince them to give us women's suffrage. Like, Douglas, what are you talking about? You can't figure out what to do. But the irony here is he says, you know, men ought to be silent, and he continues talking, right? Let me show you something else Frederick Douglass says. He says, I've been thinking, too, of the strong conviction, the noble courage, the sublime faith in God and men that it must have required for women to pull this off. What's interesting to me about this statement is Douglas gives the credit unto women's ability to honor God and man as their strength. And of course, we know then and even now, people most think of God as man. So all of this reverence, all of this genuflecting, all this bowing down to men and maleness for a woman's cause. He doesn't ever say the strength a woman must have found within herself to be able to confront the legislature of the day, to be able to stand up in a public place and demand what men are saying no to. Oh, women, what power must be within you? He says, God was your guide. You must have had the strength of men, right? It's not the strength of women. Show you something else Douglas says. Douglas goes on and says, he says, we could easily make men see the misery, the debasement, the terrible suffering caused by intemperance. We could easily make men see the desolation wrought by war and the hell-black horrors of chattel slavery. But the case was different in the movement for women's suffrage. Men took for granted all that could be said against intemperance, war, and slavery. But no such advantage was found in the beginning of the cause of suffrage for women. On the contrary, everything in her condition was supposed to be lovely, just as it should be. She had no rights denied, no wrongs to redress. She herself had no suspicion but that all was going well. She floated along on the tide of life as her mother and grandmother had done before her, as in a dream of paradise. Her wrongs, if she had any, were too occult to be seen and too light to be felt. It required a daring voice and a determined hand to awake her from the delightful dream and call the nation to account for the rights and opportunities of which it was depriving her. This is a very complicated position I think Douglas takes. See, on the one hand, Douglas critiques men for the assumption that women live in a kind of paradise because we as men take care of women. Right, good, okay, Douglas, seems like you're onto something. But where Douglas falls short is he insults women, I suggest, by assuming that the women think of their own lives as a blissful kind of dream. If you just had the right man who did the right thing, who knew how to provide, you straight. So the problem is not the notion of women's suffrage, really. The problem is trifling men. Which is interesting because somehow, again, at a women's international conference, how does the man get to be the center of the analysis? Douglas just cannot seem to get away from his own patriarchy. In fact, one might argue that Douglas misses the point altogether of the convening. He asserts, quote, "This is the end of the fought decade of the woman's suffrage movement. This is indeed a kind of jubilee." But the interesting thing, according to historical data, is that the women were not shouting at this conference. And I say, Douglas says, jubilee? The women understood the work ahead, and they weren't finished until women had the right to vote. Douglas, on the other hand, is absolutely ecstatic. In fact, he appears to, how do I want to say this? Almost to insult, again, women. And he appears to almost clap for women to say, I can't believe y'all actually stood up and took on this mantle against men. I mean, you're unbelievable. You would actually confront a man in public? Go ahead, girl. You know. And again, it's almost a patronizing kind of applause, as if Douglas is impressed that women even would stand up. And the interesting thing is Douglas says jubilee because it seems to be, in Douglas's head, it doesn't really matter if women actually get the right to vote or not, though that's exactly what the point here is. Douglas seems to applaud just the fact that you would stand up and ask for it. Like, wow, how bold must you be? That just must be incredible. But then, from my perspective, later on in the speech, and the speech goes on and on and on, right? Douglas says, who were we? He says, I count myself in, who did this woman's suffrage thing. And I said, we? I said, how does Douglas now deem himself an architect of the woman's suffrage movement? Well, he says, well, you know, I was there from the beginning. At the initial meeting, I was in Seneca Falls, and he absolutely was, and I was in support, he was. And the thing that's tricky, and I'm critiquing myself too here as a man, but what's interesting to me that this made me see is, if men are present, we need credit. It doesn't seem as if we can be present and supportive without getting our name in lights. You know, this notion that it's a woman's conference, sure, it's a woman's conference, but the fact that I'm a man and I'm at this woman's conference, you got to clap for me. Come on now. I mean, I showed up. And I wasn't even supposed to be here. But the truth is, yes, you were supposed to be there. Because shouldn't a man support a woman's life without having to even wonder whether or not you're the benefactor? In fact, aren't you the benefactor just because a human being's life has been made better? I feel like, you know what, I feel like this is the same, I know I'm about to get in trouble, but, you know, I'm leaving tonight, so I'm going to just say this. You know, I feel like this is the same thing whites did in the 60s with black movement. I showed up, so I am the liberal white. Don't be talking about we all racist. Don't do that, because here I am, and this is a colored people thing. And I showed up. Write my name down. I was at the movement. And of course, black folks are you really serious? And then what hit me, I was like, oh my God, have we done that in terms of gender too? Are men just that, are we that self-referential? Are we that arrogant? Are we that self-absorbed? Whoo-wee, I hope not. I pray not. I know all the brothers in here, you're not. So we're gonna talk about all the other brothers who didn't come to this symposium today, right? In fact, you know what's really funny? When pressed against the wall, and Douglas was asked to stand in front of Congress at the time and to support women's suffrage, you know what really happened, y'all? He didn't. In fact, he said, part of the issue was Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others at the time were trying to get women's suffrage while Douglas was pressing for black men's right to vote, all right? Douglas said black men should get the right to vote before women. Women should have it, but men should get it first. And when asked why, Douglas said, well, the vicissitudes of a black man's life are unparalleled by anything a woman has ever known. So somehow that support of this women's suffrage, it didn't translate real good. You know, something didn't sink in. Douglas, you know, what happened? But of course, you know, we can't be too hard on the brother. You know, he's a product of his time, right? I'm just showing you the excuses that we've made historically, and to let us off the hook in terms of how we have not fought for women's rights. And I'm using Douglas in this case because I feel like Douglas has been championed as the quintessential sign and the quintessential model of manhood and black manhood in the entirety of the 19th century. Douglas gets the crown of masculinity. Douglas gets the crown of elocution. Douglas is the man. You know, if Douglas got invited to the White House when black folks were still, you know, cooking in the White House as slaves, Douglas gets to come in and sit down with the president. This the man. But somehow, on the issue of women and women's issues and women's suffrage, I think Douglas still falls a little short. Just a little short. I still want to say I think Douglas is still to be commended for standing up, because even the fact that Douglas would go to this convention, I do think is a good thing. The thing I'm wrestling with is trying not to give Douglas too much praise just for Douglas showing up. Though at the time, showing up meant a lot, if y'all understand what I'm saying, right? And he even critiques his own battle with his own patriarchy and his own self-referentialism, when later on in the speech he says, quote, "When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I advocated emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question. And I found myself a little noble." Right? You know, the thing that's tricky here is, I was like, well, you know, Douglas, you get noble because you fought for something where you didn't benefit? Or you felt like you might not benefit as directly? Why is that more noble? You know? I argue that it should be simply seen as an act of righteousness and an act of justice. Douglas is clearly still fighting this tension between patriarchal privilege and the sacrifice of it for the social uplift of women. I think it's an honorable fight, to be sure, but he certainly isn't finished. Later in the speech, Douglas once again falters on the side of patriarchy, I think, when he says, quote, "The benefits accruing from this women's movement for the equal rights of women are not confined or limited to women alone." Now, of course, y'all know the problem. Like, why do we have to say that? You know, it's like, again, telling white Americans the civil rights movement, it's for you too. It really is for you. Trust me, you're gonna get something out of this. Even if it's just a good night's sleep, you know, it is for you too. You know, it's just so absolutely patronizing in some ways. But you know what's really interesting? What if it wasn't? You know, what if Douglas didn't benefit at all? You know, I would like to suggest that the fight would be just as noble whether he was the benefactor or not. And in fact, the statement implies that Douglas's support of the movement happens only because somehow he has imagined how the women's suffrage movement would leave him better off. The implication here is that Douglas seems also to believe that anything that included men or where the men were the center, women are the automatic benefactor because you're attached to man. So that if man is exalted, the woman goes with him. But somehow, if women are exalted, the man's not sure if he goes with her. And I think this left Douglass in a very tricky place in terms of trying to figure out just how much and how far he was going to go in terms of supporting this women's suffrage issue. The irony of all of this, y'all, is that if Douglass isn't careful, he has become the opportunistic slave master of women. The same thing from which he just escaped. His intentions are certainly honorable, yet his words and his deeds are still laced with selfishness and the hope that all women's business will somehow ultimately increase his life. Certainly, Douglass is ahead of his time in terms of men who supported women's suffrage. He seeks to do the right thing, the righteous thing, the noble thing by attending the International Council of Women in D.C. in 1888. And from all historical accounts, his presence was welcomed and applauded. Yet Douglass had a few more miles to travel, I contend, to reach the place of full support of women, a place where he as a man was not the center. The most obvious sign of Douglass's struggle, the most obvious sign of Douglass's hypocrisy, is that he delivers this 34-minute speech after he has already said that all men, like himself, ought to just sit back and close our mouths.